Hi, welcome to the Future Insights Network podcast. Our guest this week is Andreas Wieland, who is Associate Professor of Supply Chain Risk Management at Copenhagen Business School. Welcome.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Maria, for inviting me.
It's our pleasure. It's our pleasure. So we're going to talk about some of your key topics and interests. But before we get into some of those in detail, can you just tell us a bit about your career story and journey so far?
Yes, sure. So I did my master's in information systems. So I actually have a bit of an IT background, but IT management background. And I have a major also in economics. So that also where supply chain management came into play. So somewhere between these two extremes. And yeah, then I did my PhD at the Technical University in Berlin. Which was about supply chain risk management already, security issues there. Yeah, that brought me in the area, and I, for some reasons, remained there. So I really like it, and I think it's a fascinating part of the SCM area.
Yeah.
And yeah, in 2014, I moved to Copenhagen. I'm an associate professor here now, and supply chain risk management is also the area where I'm working in.
Yeah. So you've mentioned risk management, and I think we're going to talk a bit about resilience in supply chains as well. You know, one of the things that we're all aware of, anybody working in this space, is that the world is potentially a more changing, unstable,
uncertain, volatile. All of the above.
All of the above. There are a lot of factors at play. So before we get into some of those direct impacts, can you tell us a bit about what you understand by the idea of resilience in supply chains? So I think that's relevant to then how we talk about how you build it into strategy.
Yeah, so I think in the supply chain literature, what you see a lot is that people define supply chain resilience as somehow the ability to bounce back. So you're disturbed and then you're going back. But I see it also a bit about moving back if it's necessary, but also moving forward, because we don't look at a static system. As supply chain is not a static system. That later we might talk about this a bit. The supply chain is constantly changing, and also problems around us are changing. The environment is changing, and I see it more as a way to cope with change, but also to drive change. So internally in the supply chain, there's a lot of change that where you have a certain control on it, but also outside. So to adapt to this is where I believe supply chain resilience should look at.
Okay.
Do you think it's more about adaptability than anything in terms of supply chain resilience is adaptability?
It's a very important issue in resilience, and outside of supply chain management, for instance, in ecology or in psychology and other disciplines, they also talk about resilience, and their adaptability plays a much bigger role than in supply chain management so far. And I think it makes sense also to focus on this.
Yeah, so it's perhaps about being prepared for what's coming, even if you don't know directly the factors that are going to impact you. Having, whether it's a supply chain strategy or a personal coping mechanism in sort of psychology, so it's just to be ready for whatever this unstable world throws at you, I guess, is part of that.
Exactly,
so when we talk about supply chains, and, you know, globalization, we're dealing with and talking to global brands with complex supply chains around the world. What are those big kind of factors that impact across supply chains where resilience is necessary in order to cope?
Yes. So of course, within your own supply chain, there's a lot of little things that are going on, that are constantly going on, but sometimes also bigger things. So that can go, I mean, there's all these examples of fires breaking out at the premise of a key supplier, or earthquakes like some years ago in Japan. But I think it's also about the small things that are going on. So that's why adaptability is so relevant. The supply chain has traditionally, I think, always seen as a network. So maybe, I mean, it's seen as a chain traditionally, but then in the supply chain literature, we're talking about networks. And I think that's maybe not the right view on it. We should somehow, so maybe you could say we look at supply chains like, or we assume that it's like the bird's eye perspective. A bird looking at a network from above has the total control or the total view on the network. And I think it's more like I call it like a frog sitting in the fog. So you're looking around, you're seeing a bit, you see your neighbors, the direct suppliers, but how can you control such a system where you don't even know who the second tier and the third tier is? Many companies produce parts and they don't know really where these parts end in the end. Often you knew this, but sometimes you don't because it also has multiple purposes and is part of several products in the end. And resilience talks about, as I understand it, adapting to these changing environments and these different supply chains you are part of. And of course, companies constantly need to react what the consumers want. And therefore, I think this is so important to understand that we're actually not in the position of this bird.
And I think that question of scale you mentioned is quite interesting, because I think it's easy to think about these global factors in terms of the things that attract headlines. So,
well, the easy things to pick on.
Volcanoes in Iceland, or wildfires in the States.
Or earthquakes in Japan.
Yeah, or Trump being elected, or whatever we think of these big geopolitical factors. But it sounds like you're talking about it's a mistake to just focus on that level. You need to be much more sort of micro in your approach, because they're the more likely factors that are going to impact you more frequently.
I would say this is important. It's very important to look at you called it scale, or like what the frog sees, to use my own picture. But I think it's also important that we need to see the other scales that are there. For instance, traditionally, I mean, where does SCM come from? It comes from from acknowledging, if you look at the bullwhip effect, that just managing your own system, which is your own organization traditionally, or your business function, maybe your department, is not enough. You need a more holistic view, looking at all the other departments as well, not just logistics, but also procurement and finance. And then later, looking at your suppliers, looking at your buyers. So to understand the bullwhip effect, it was necessary to understand the bigger picture. Before it was just uncertainties going on, and now suddenly, by understanding the bigger picture, you suddenly can control it. So you say it's important to look at your small world, maybe where the frog is sitting. I think that's very important, but we also need to acknowledge there's smaller things that can disturb us. So like another department, suddenly something is going on there, and then the entire company is affected, and then maybe even the entire supply chain is affected. But also things, and I think this has mostly neglected in supply chain management, also the even bigger picture, like planetary boundaries, for instance. Why are we not managing them? So if we assume there's this supply chain that we are controlling, there's this modernist dream to control the entire supply chain using blockchain technology. And I think that makes a lot of sense. But we are also forgetting a bit that the supply chain is also embedded in a bigger system. So there's these different scales, and I think that makes a lot of sense to look at them simultaneously.
What do you think for the modern day supply chain head or supply chain director? I mean, it's a great picture to paint to be able to have control over other departments, but how realistic is it in today's supply chain to control those other factors?
Yeah, it's of course increasingly realistic, but we're still far from being able to do this. So of course, new technologies allow us to do a lot of things, but this is also a very theoretical perspective. I think more practical is, of course, also to understand, do I really trust that my supplier treats the data well that I give them, and vice versa? Do I like them even? Do I know them for quite some years? Of course, there needs to be this collaboration, but I think we still have de facto companies. So there's legal entities, which is a company that are controlled, and not the supply chain. Supply chain is a very fuzzy thing, right? It's something nobody really knows what it is, and still it needs to be managed, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So when you're talking about integrating it with or working with other functions, do you see that happening at the moment to enough extent, or is supply chain and
Siloed.
logistics still too siloed and still just carrying out its activities without being part of that end-to-end value chain across the business?
So first of all, I think to have this end-to-end view, you first need to have this interfunctional view within your own company. So you need to do your own homework before you can think bigger.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I think this is not happening at all. So of course we have process orientation in many companies, but still there's these little silo princes or kings or queens or whatever. Yeah. Also,
I like that idea of silo princes or silo. But you're not wrong. I mean, it is almost egocentric to some degree. You know, people do like to take care of their
ruling their own kingdom,
ruling their square meter, and as long as I'm doing my bit right, that's enough. The end-to-end visibility factor is increasingly important, isn't it? Because as you say, maybe you're taking care of your little kingdom, but if something breaks over there, it's very hard to be resilient to those kinds of damages. You know.
Yeah. 100%.
Or problems.
Yeah, I mean, and you obviously are researching what's going on around the world. What might be an example where an organization hasn't created this proactive supply chain strategy and therefore is constantly reacting rather than anticipating or able to head off problems as they happen? What are the common areas and problems that you see impacting businesses?
Yeah, I think a lot of things are relatively stable. We have a lot of business processes that are even codified, and still companies are firefighting all the time. Maybe because either they're not really looking at their own processes properly, or maybe they're ill-defined as well. So I think firefighting makes a lot of sense in certain situations where there's even crisis coming up, or a fire breaks out. I mean, that's why it's called firefighting, right? Reactive strategies. Suddenly a supplier doesn't deliver enough, or the quality doesn't work. So the processes might come to a halt. Then it's very Then it's very important, of course, to be reactive. But I think focusing on more proactive strategies, so thinking in a long-term perspective, looking forward, what is going on, what the future might also want from us. I think this is very important, and it's surprisingly maybe overlooked. So I think this focus on reactivity is a very important aspect, especially when it comes to what customers want. Consumers change their wishes all the time, and that has even increased over the last couple of years. That we can see this in many studies. But that's not enough to be just reactive. We need to stand on two legs, right? The proactive and the reactive one.
Do you think, or how much of supply chain resilience or risk is a mindset thing? You know, in other words, cultural within an organization as opposed to business processes?
I think this is the key. Not only risk management, look at other areas, innovation, even introducing a new software system. So if this is not understood by the entire company, if there's just this small department, they're trying their own thing and it has no top management support, then you will definitely fail. And especially when it comes to supply chain risk-related issues, then risk is just a cost factor. Why should I have risk? We didn't have a fire. Why should I invest in a team that can manage this? This is just expensive. But really to understand this and to see in the long term, we really will benefit. We will survive even maybe by investing in this. I think this is really key. So the culture, it's top down. So the C-level is certainly involved, but it's also needs to go all the way down to all managers in the company, that they have this risk understanding, risk culture as well. So that's the internal view, at least. So that's very important.
Well, but I would say it also extends to your supplier network to
Yeah.
some degree. You know, if
Yes.
you as the prime supplier are, or the prime organization are very risk conscious and very much looking at from a cultural perspective, all elements of your supply chain, then you insist, wouldn't you, that the people that you're working with from a supplier basis that follow some sort of processes like that.
Yeah, I mean, the expression is the chain is only as strong as its weakest link, and it's incredibly apt here, isn't it? If you don't have visibility across your supply chain.
Well, you mentioned something earlier, Andreas, about how, you know, you can't have the bird's eye view because sometimes you don't know what 2 layers deep or 3 layers deep, what someone else's internal practices look like. Do you think that there should be more of a focus or more of an interest from the people heading up supply chain in the practices, or at least from a risk perspective, in other areas within deeper of the supply chain?
So I think there's 2 things. At the same time, it's more and more important to get control over the entire system. I think this is to try to be the bird, right? So new technology is even getting us closer to this. I call it modernist view of total control. So like seeing the supply chain like a machine. If something is broken, then I can repair it. But I think at the same time, and I think this is also part of this risk culture, not in the own company only, but also maybe what suppliers or even on the retail side needs to be done, is to acknowledge that total control is just impossible. And I think this is sometimes overlooked and forces companies then to focus on the company instead of the supply chain again, by not really looking at the bigger picture. And I think both is important.
And you know, increasingly you hear a lot of solutions around visibility, traceability, whether that's, you know, existing technology like RFID through to emerging technologies like blockchain, which are making some, you know, potentially exciting claims around visibility, end-to-end traceability. Can you see technology playing a role, and at the moment, do you think it's likely to have an immediate impact, or is it some way off? And is its impact overstated, understated? What's your sense of where technology might play a part in this?
I mean, we need to see where we are in the hype cycle for the different technologies, and I think the use cases are now emerging when it comes to blockchains, what you've mentioned. So I've seen some nice cases where companies or entire supply chains are experimenting with this. But I think what is really, really interesting is where business process management, especially in a supply chain context, might develop in the future. So automation of business processes, getting rid of all the paperwork, which also has a lot of social implications, I think. So people working in the supply chain might soon be replaced. I think this is even me as a professor here, I'm also thinking about, so will there be a hologram in the future instead of me? So, but I think this is, of course, much more relevant for repetitious tasks that can be replaced by like think about ordering processes. So simple task in the beginning, and I think the combination of process management, artificial intelligence here, that it's a very exciting area that is currently developing here. So here I see a lot of potential. I'm not sure about use cases. So there's certainly a lot of like robotic process automation. There's certainly a lot of things going on. But if we just look 5 or even 10 years ahead, I think we're almost in a time where revolution in technologies, where supply chains are really revolutionized by this. And I think that's very exciting. But this also means for supply chain managers that they really should look at what is going on, because the way we're doing supply chain management right now will certainly not be the way we're doing it in 10 years.
Yeah. But I was just going to say that's a big claim, and it's you're absolutely right. You're one of many people that are saying that the face of supply chain is changing quite dramatically. What steps can a supply chain person take today to manage their businesses themselves into the future?
Yeah, because you don't you know something's coming, but you don't know when. You know, when will these technologies become mainstream? Is it 6 months, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years? And
is the pace of change.
Yeah, you've got to manage the present whilst preparing for the future. If you don't even know when the future's coming, if you see what I mean.
So no pressure, but what's the answer?
Yeah.
Yeah. No pressure.
No pressure.
If we talk about adaptability, or we talked about it before, I think this is the mindset that we need. So we're in the 21st century, and I fear not everyone has fully understood this. So what is important in the 21st century? It's of course the technologies that we are looking at. I mentioned a few of them. It's certainly the planetary boundaries. We're talking about circular supply chains instead of linear supply chains. We're talking about really, I mean, what is it? I think it's 800 gigatons CO2 that we still have to emit, which means 20 years are left. So we urgently need to get rid of these 20th century type of business models that are carbon oriented. We really need to reinvent the entire economies. And I think those people who have understood this, and there's increasingly many who have understood this, they will be successful also in 10, 20 years. I think those who stick to the solutions of the 20th century, they will just disappear. And I'm also optimistic about this, because it's good that they disappear, because we need to take these new technological opportunities and also these really big challenges that are much bigger than just supply chain, everyday supply chain problems that we are talking about. I think here is the area where supply chain managers really need to also understand the science about it, both in the area of, for instance, sustainability, social issues, but on the other hand also really need to be up to date with the technological issues that are, or solutions that are presented here.
Yeah, and you mentioned the social aspect of it, because you never know when an issue to do with environmental sustainability or the circular economy is suddenly going to ignite in public consciousness. You look at, you know, plastics have suddenly dominated the news agenda this year, yet we've known that plastics and recycling have been an issue for a long time.
All of a sudden, overnight, plastic straws are, you know, the world's enemy.
Yeah, and that wasn't something that we didn't know before, but whether it's through media or social media.
So I guess the question is, I mean, because I wrote something down earlier when you were talking, let's compare a supply chain today, maybe even a supply chain tomorrow versus a supply chain 20, 30 years ago. How important is social media and the consumer behavior, or the impact of the consumer in today's supply chain?
It's not just in the supply chain. I think if we look at how politics works today, how business works today, and especially then in the supply chain. So suddenly child work happening 3 tiers upstream plays a role for the profit of their own company. Yeah. Although unfortunately there's a recent study showing the stock market forgets quite quickly what is going on here, which is sad, of course. But I think in general the perception of consumers is going faster and faster, and people also forget quite rapidly. And I think that's maybe the opposite of what is needed, because the problems are bigger and bigger and more global. And currently we are seeing, I mean, you're in the UK, Brexit, like going from global solutions to very local solutions, and assuming that we can get back the world that we had in maybe 100 years ago. I think this is a dream, and it might be
I'd like to wake up
for
from that dream. I'd like to wake up from that dream. It's not a good dream.
Yeah, it's but for many people it is a dream, and I think it should also be acknowledged. But it just doesn't help us to solve these big problems that are even far beyond the own supply chain. And we talked about scales before. The scale of management 100 years ago or 50 years ago was the company, and then it has become the supply chain, which is a great thing. We really went beyond the own company, But now we need to go even one step beyond that and look at the even bigger picture, the planetary boundaries that I was talking about. So when you ask me where people should, what should people, how should people understand these problems? What is the new plastic straw in the future? It might also require people to read maybe Science, Nature, these scientific journals where they actually discuss these big problems, and not just business journals, because here the focus is business, and we need to go one step beyond that.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, if you look at geopolitically right now, there's almost a bit of denial on a lot of these climate change issues, and the signs that you say that are pretty obvious to a lot of people are being ignored. And do you think that's because business has predominantly been managed by a smaller group of people to some degree, you know, a hierarchy of people, whereas now with consumers having more of an opinion and having more of a say, do you think that that will shift over time so that this is going to be put front of mind, you know, that companies will need to be sourcing ethically, having some sort of sustainable structure in place into their businesses? I mean, how important is this, and how should a supply chain director today be looking at this as something on the list of priorities?
I mean, there was, if you mentioned climate issues, there was a debate maybe 50 years ago. Is climate change really man-made? I think that at least scientifically the debate is entirely over. So there's no debate anymore. There's agreement in the scientific community. But I mean, what is well documented is, of course, lobbyism from certain industries, oil industries. I mean, this is really well documented. Also, how this creates uncertainty in the society, and those who are maybe not so familiar with the scientific knowledge. I think it's sometimes interesting also to see that people look out of the window and think, yeah, the sun is not shining today, so my gut feeling shows me there's no climate change, while international scientific teams with hundreds of scientists and super complex models calculate weeks to get certain findings, and you still think, because I'm looking out of the window, my opinion is more valuable what these scientists find. So I think to look at the big picture, we really need to also re-acknowledge how knowledge is actually created, and we are in a very, very turbulent time politically, I think. But I am also optimistic that that this denial. Look at theory of evolution. 100 years ago, there was a lot of backfire here, and today nobody would ever think this doesn't exist as a phenomenon of explanation, right? And I think the same will happen here, but we're losing time. I mean, in terms of climate change, as I said before, we have like 20 years left to get carbon free, and I can't see big developments in certain regions, and we still have coal power, we still have combustion engines.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like the stakeholders that supply chain leaders have to manage and pick up signals from and respond to are so much wider now. I mean, in the past, you might say they responded to chief financial officers talking about cutting costs and operational efficiency, and those are their primary drivers for making change happen. But now you're looking at what do your consumers make of, whether it's your approach to sustainable sourcing or ethical manufacturing practices, or the last mile delivery and customer service that you offer as a supply chain provider as well. So they're having to kind of look in 360 degrees now to be effective and to keep their organization's position well.
But you know, I think it's a, like you say, Andreas, it's a bit of a volatile, challenging time right now. You don't know when the next plastic straw scenario is going to land. Yeah. I mean, hopefully this is all good stuff because we're making good inroads with regards to sustainability and so forth. But so it's very difficult as a supply chain director to be able to manage a whole end-to-end supply chain without knowing when the next next big PR bomb is going to drop.
And which, you might be aware of multiple issues, but which one is going to ignite next and be the one that you're forced to take action about? it's a challenge. But it goes back to this idea of building a resilient supply chain, that you
And an
are at least
adaptable,
aware
yeah,
of the risks. You have strategies in place to respond or even mitigate their impact in the first place. So I guess, yeah, it's about this proactive front foot approach to managing your strategy.
Can I ask you, I mean, you obviously teach, you teach this subject. So what are the students, you know, the supply chain leaders of tomorrow, what is their view of the supply chain world that they're entering?
So I think many of them are, because they're young, because they are still open and listening to a lot of things that are going on. And I mean, this year's summer here in Europe, but also look at the wildfires now in the US. I think the last person should have understood now how important, for instance, this topic of climate change is. I think they're very curious about this. They're very concerned. They understand how important that is, but they also see the opportunity, because as I said before, to be a leader in the 21st century in the SCM area, but in business, I think in general, if you haven't done your homework, haven't understood these two topics that I mentioned, planetary boundaries, sustainability, and on the other hand, the technologies, then you won't be successful. And I think these young leaders, they are curious how to find solutions. And I think there's solutions even on the horizon that can be used there. I'm teaching some of them, and at least giving some indications how we could transform the way supply chain management is done in this century.
Yeah, I mean, actually, the fact that these issues exist is not a good thing, yet their existence and the ability of supply chain management to tackle with them and be part of the organization that's dealing with them is actually a useful story to tell graduates and recruits into the industry. Because if you're looking for a career with a sense of purpose or a mission behind it, and this is one. Do you get a sense from the younger people that you're teaching that being that change agent and helping to tackle some of these global issues is an attractive part of this industry?
I mean, there's a lot of studies saying people, of course, I want to earn a lot of money and everyone wants this, but I think for most people, this bigger picture, this bigger narrative plays a much bigger role, and people rather would say, let's earn a bit less, but do something meaningful in different areas. I mean, that could be to have great products where customers are very happy in the end, but that could also be this narrative that I described before, that is related to these big challenges, which are like the Damocles sword hanging over us. We need to find business models that provide solutions. And for instance, moving from linear to circular supply chains, even moving from customer orientation, away from customer orientation to user orientation. And we've seen this already in the car industry. I mean, I live in Copenhagen. I'm cycling to my office, and most people here do. But this is, of course, something that you don't see in many other places yet.
No.
But yeah, in many European cities or North American cities as well, you don't want to own anymore. You lease. So we're getting away from products to services.
Mm-hmm.
In the future, I could even imagine, not even from an environmental point of view, but that, for instance, smartphone companies won't sell a phone anymore, but the service to use a phone. And it makes economically sense, because then you own the resources, then you own the material that is in the phone, and then you provide a new phone to the customers in the future, who constantly get the newest version, but you also design them in a different way so that the customers will get the newest technology, but you as a producer in your supply chain also keep track on what is going on. And then we don't need recycling anymore. Then we just build products in a way that are automatically circular. And I'm pretty sure big companies already are planning this, and I've even heard some ideas in that direction.
So it's another requirement for the conventional supply chain manager, supply chain leader mindset to broaden horizons again and think about new models of
different business
product
models.
development. Yeah,
Different business models in general.
fundamentally.
I mean, fundamental, exactly as you're saying, because I mean, what used to be pretty standard stuff, I produce a product, I give it to you, then you buy a new one,
Yeah.
which creates, obviously it creates environmental issues. If we look at different ways of, you know, doing things, I mean, that's why disruptive companies like Uber and Airbnb and stuff are changing the way people are thinking about how we
Exactly.
interact with different things. Do you think that that's going to have a big impact in supply chains, in companies coming in, disruptors coming in and changing the way we do things?
I think we will definitely see this, and in some areas, you mentioned Uber. We've seen this already. We will also see this a radical transformation in terms of business models also in our area. So I'm pretty sure in the 21st century we will go away from linear supply chains to circular. I don't know if we can call them chain then anymore, because
No.
chain is per definition end-to-end or linear, right? And I'm pretty sure we are increasingly going away from consumers or customers to users, because we only have one planet. So there is I mean, it's simple math, right? We have currently a growth economy, so that is building on growth and exponential growth even. So um, economic growth is a good thing, but at the same time we only have one planet, so there's this limitation, which is one planet, right? So and this is a contradiction, but I think we can to a certain extent resolve this by going away from these growth models towards retaining instead of growing, or I don't know. And that sounds maybe a bit tree hugging, I don't know, but I'm pretty sure that only those companies who are aware of these constraints by nature will be able to solve the problems and create business models that customers will soon accept. I'm pretty sure.
I mean, we've outlined a lot of challenges and changes that supply chain leaders need to make, and we've outlined these factors that are going to buffet their organizations and potentially, you know, push them in one direction or another. And we're being quite hard on them in a sense, but let's kind of speak up for the supply chain leaders and say which sectors maybe or types of organization are doing a good job at the moment, and where you can see real progress being made in terms of whether it's building resilience or building in a more sustainable approach.
Yeah, where should we look for good examples?
Yeah.
I mean, it might surprise you, but I think companies like the big electronic companies, they are leading technologically. I think there's no doubt, but I think they are also the ones that are most future oriented. So they have already realized, and they also have the power, of course, to control an entire supply chain. They've increasingly realized that the consumer-oriented business models will come to an end, and that for them it's very important to own the resources instead of putting them in the phone and selling it to the consumers, because that's just what I described before, right? I think there are certain industries that are improving a lot. Look at the textile industry, especially here in Europe. The learning curve was after Rana Plaza was really high. I'm not saying that everything is perfect though, so there's still a lot of room for improvement. And also here, the fast fashion business model might not be future-proof as well. So we need to think, and also companies need to think, what comes after this business model, which was very successful the last 30 years or so. But we also see that some of these companies have recently struggled a bit. So the question also here is, how can this be made future-proof and even circular? And then we see, for instance, the food industry, where I really wonder, I don't know, in the UK, you had the horse meat scandal some years ago. If you look at how long the supply chain was here, And actually everyone in the supply chain has just made their homework, following maybe the supply chain textbooks, saying, yeah, I'm just managing what is my core competency and outsource the rest. And this has increased the length of the supply chain, the complexity. So maybe the monster that we're currently trying to tame was created because of supply chain management, and now we need supply chain management to tame it again. I think that's quite an interesting issue.
Yeah.
That's a very good point. I mean, and so maybe that's why we have to look into the future for the leaders of tomorrow to come in with a different perspective, with a different viewpoint on how to tame this beast, this supply chain beast that we have.
Yes, and that also requires, again, to look beyond the own company, but also look beyond the own supply chain, because only then we can understand what is actually going on.
So I was going to say, to recap then, I would say, start to look within your organization, so outside of your own square meter, get away from the supply chain kings and princes, look outside of that, then start to look at the outside world as well. Right?
Exactly. And understanding that there is that the supply chain itself is not controllable per se. We can try to make this better, and technology helps, but there is a limit, and that's my frog in the fog.
Well, I think that's a useful model that people can take away from this, and I think it's perhaps a good point to wrap things up, because I think it'll resonate with people that the changing view, their viewpoint, and the view of them from the rest of the organization is changing, that they have to be adapting and taking this more holistic approach, because they have a much more holistic set of challenges, much more diverse set of stakeholders they've got to satisfy and manage internally and externally. So yeah, it's changing, but there are ways to do it by the sounds of it, and I think that's a good point to maybe draw the conversation.
And resilience is adaptability.
Yeah,
it goes in this direction. Yes,
absolutely. So Andreas, thanks so much for joining us. It's been a really interesting conversation.
Yes, thank you.
And I think we've outlined some issues that supply chain leaders and manufacturing leaders and business transformation leaders can think about for the future. So thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me.
Thanks. Andreas. Bye.
Bye.